In this video, I'd like to take a slightly different direction and talk about one of the constructs or tools within C# that we'll be utilizing in our projects and kind of what it is, how it works, and why is it relevant. The construct I actually want to cover is the Lambda expression. Now, you've probably seen us use Lambda expressions in very small, tiny doses throughout the project thus far. Specifically, you've seen them with the HTML helpers, and when we go to identify or select the property that we want the HTML helper to use. So I want to kind of dig into that, and I'm actually going to dig into it from two perspectives. I'm going to look at it from the entity framework scenario and the HTML helper scenario. Now, a lambda expression is simply a specialized type of expression that you can write in C#, and it allows you to do one of two things. It allows you to essentially express a property or a selection that you want to make, or it can be used as a function delegate. If you're familiar with delegates, those are basically functions that can then be treated as variables, and we have the ability to inline create those functions using our lambda expressions, and then the selection is what you saw previously using the HTML helpers by taking an object and then identifying or selecting a particular property, and then that gets consumed by the helper, and it then knows how to render out a text box for a particular property. So looking at the controller action that's in front of you, what I'd like to do is I want to replace this static initialization of a collection with access to a collection from a database. Now in this project, I've gone ahead and I've extended my models folder. I moved my view model for my user view model into a view models folder, and I now have a module 6 DB context as well as a user class which has my attributes set up for my database table. Under my app data, I've gone ahead and created a module 6 DB database, and I have access to that under my server explorer, and I have a table in here called users, and inside of users I have 4 different users. So all of that is set up and in place. Also under my web config, I have my connection string set up. So I'm accessing module 6db.mdf. It has the same name as my DB context, so I don't have to explicitly define that. It will be picked up by the context. Now, from my home controller, what I'd like to do is I'd like to get rid of this list that's here, this collection of users, and I want to replace it with a collection of users coming from the database. And then I'm going to use my lambda expressions to filter or restrict the result set that I'm actually getting from the database. And how do I do that? So I'm going to still create a list of user view model, and I'll call it the collection of users. So the variable will be the same, but then I'm also going to create an instance of my module 6 DB context. Now I'm actually going to do a new instance of that. So I now have my context. I'm going to say context dot users. And if you notice here, my return type for context.users is a DB set of user. Now off of that DB set, I have a whole range of different functions that I can call. We have all, any, some as parallels, some casting options, some element at. There's the first function, and we'll get to that in a moment. First or default. Further down here we have things like select. There's single, you can skip. There's a take. And then you can convert things to an array, to a dictionary, to a list, to a lookup. You can do unions, and you can do wheres, and then you can also do what are called zips. The one that I'm most interested at this point is the toList. So I'm going to go ahead and convert this DB set to a list. And I'll just call it with the open and close parentheses, and I can say my collection of users equals context.users.toList. So what happens here is I have my user object, and I'm converting it to list. The problem I have here is that my object coming from my database is a user object, but my collection of users is a user view model. So I can't actually store my users in my collection of users. Now, if I wanted to, I could do a few things here. I could say list of user, and I can say this is db users, and then I could do for each user dbu and db users, and then say collection of users dot add new user view model, and then I'd have to go through and basically map my db user property to my user view model. So we say users dbu dot first name, last name equals dbu dot last name, and you get the idea. The problem with doing this is that it works, but it's additional lines of code, and it gets, it's a little kind of gives you a level of uncertainty of what exactly is happening here and how do we know what's going on. So instead, what I'd like to do is try to consolidate this down into really just kind of one or two steps. So we have the initialization step of our user. I'm going to go ahead and actually pull that out. I want to use that again, but I'd like to get rid of this for each loop, and I'd like to get rid of this additional list. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here and say collection of users, and I'll say context.users, but then I want to do a dot select, and the dot select is a function, and it takes what is referred to as a link expression. And you'll notice that it's a system.link.expression, and that expression class is a generic, and that it takes a function, and then that function takes in a user, and then it will also take in an integer, and then it'll return a t result. And that kind of as a collective is referred to as the selector. So that expression is the selector. And so what the select function does is it takes in one of these lambda expressions, and that lambda expression allows you to do essentially the equivalent of a select statement from your SQL, but it's even more powerful because we can actually select values out of our database and then load them into an object and then convert that into a list and then return that list. So what does that mean in a concrete terms? We're actually going to use the select to take each row from the database one at a time, and we're going to convert it into a user view model object, and then we're going to end up with a collection of user view model objects, and then we're going to call toList on that, which will give us the final output of a list of user view models. So instead of doing those steps in 3 or 4 lines, we're going to end up actually doing it in roughly 2 lines. So from the select, the first thing that we want is that we're going to have to create kind of what I like to term the designator or the initializer side of our Lambda expression. Now, if you think about this, I'm going to use dbu again. And dbu before was one item from our list of users that came from the database. dbu in this context still is that same one item. So dbu is the variable that will represent one item out of context.users. So that's one single row is represented in the dbu variable. So we're going to take dbu, and then we want to, using the arrow, we say take dbu and do an action. In this case, that action will be the new view model. So I'm going to go ahead and just paste that code that I cut previously. And then we'll see here that we now have select, and we're going to select dbu, or one of our users, and then the action we want to perform using the dbu is we want to say create a new user view model, and then set the user view model's first name equal to dbu's first name, and so forth. So now at this point we've now taken one row at a time, and we're looping through all the rows in our select function, but it's going to take this lambda expression kind of as its own function, and it's going to pass one user from the context.users, from the table of users, and it's going to take that one DBU user, and it's going to basically pass it into a function that creates a new user view model, copies those values for us, and then returns us a new collection or a new set of objects. And we'll notice if we mouse over select here and we look at our IntelliSense, we'll see now that we're actually getting returned back an iQueryable of user view model. And that statement is right below my cursor here on the screen. So we're getting back an iQueryable of user view model. So we're almost there. Now we need to convert that iQueryable to a list. So if we do dot again, we'll see that that toList function exists. So we'll say dot toList. And then we'll see that all of our red squiggles go away. So this collection of users is a list of user view model. So from our context, we're grabbing all the users. From there, we're doing a select, and we're saying select one DB user at a time, and take that DB user and do a new user view model. And then we're using the inline instantiation to copy the values from the DBU object into our new user view model. And then once we get back that iQueryable, that collection of user view models, then we're chaining together with that the .toList to convert it from an iQueryable of user view model to a list of user view model. So now we have a list of user view models. So if we save that, we'll go ahead and hit play here. And we'll see that we end up with the same result. Here's our names, email addresses, passwords, and we have Kevin, Steve, Bill, and Larry. All four of those objects came from our database and then were presented on our page. So if we jump into our Server Explorer, right-click, View Table Data, we'll see all four of our objects. So just to verify that, we'll add one more object. And we'll do another Larry Ellison. So we've added to our database. There's no need to rebuild by simply adding data to our database. We'll come back over to our web page, we'll hit F5, refresh, and we'll pull back from there the data. I'm not sure why we're getting an error here, so let's take a look. It was attempting to create the database file, but it already exists. We did our insert, we saved. We'll go ahead and hit continue here. Let's refresh again. Let's go ahead and stop and we'll reload. Very interesting. Oh, and everything worked. I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not sure what that was. But I am curious. Let's go ahead and try it one more time. I'm going to right click on my users table and we'll say John Doe. So we'll add that, we'll close, and we'll refresh. And you ended up with the same error. So let's stop, we'll play again. And refresh with no problems. That is interesting. I have not run across that issue yet before. My guess would be that we're running into a locking issue between managing and updating the MDF file within Visual Studio versus actually editing or not editing, but loading the content out of the ASP.NET engine. So I I don't have a good explanation for that, but hopefully if you're seeing that while you're doing your development, that gives you kind of a sense of maybe what's going on. And my solution to that was simply to stop Visual Studio and then start again. And by doing that, that seemed to take care of that refresh issue, and getting the lock exception that was coming up. Alright, so there's a little bit of debug help as well. Unplanned and unexpected, but hopefully that's useful information to you as we are going through your development. And that is the process of using a Lambda expression and a select statement.